My name is Bridget Caffrey. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Chester in social work, and I am still a registered social worker, although I am in education these days rather than frontline practice.
My name's Siobhan Maclean. I'm an independent social worker. I do a lot of writing and training now around the area of theory and critical reflection, and I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Chester.
This is a full training video for people who want to learn how to facilitate reflective connections sessions. If you watch the whole video from start to finish, it's about an hour and 40 minutes long, but you could break it up, and here's what you're about to see in this training video. We start off with a short film, Bridget and Siobhan in conversation, exploring the story behind the model. How did the University of Chester Reflective Connections model come about? We then move on to a spoken PowerPoint. It's about 12 minutes long, and this particular spoken PowerPoint explores moral injury and looks at how the reflective connections model might mitigate the risks of moral injury in social workers. We move to another spoken PowerPoint, which is about 10 minutes long. This one looks specifically at how the model actually works. So in some ways, we've looked at what the model is and why we developed it. Now we start to look at how the model actually works in around 10 minutes of spoken PowerPoint. Then the main part of the training video is extracts from an actual reflective connections session. It's around 35 to 40 minutes of video footage. This isn't a whole reflective session, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that might be being discussed. It's a real session. It wasn't put on simply for training purposes. It is an actual session that we videoed with consent, and we've been very careful about how we've edited it out to maintain confidentiality from the session. We thought though that in a training video it's actually really important for you to see what an actual session might look like. Ideally, of course, you would be in a session and you would experience a session. But for a training video purposes, this was the best that we could do. There's around, well, the key parts of an actual reflective connections session. That's followed by people in that session giving some feedback on the model, how they found it, what their thoughts about the model are. It's just a few minutes really. And then the final part of the session is again a spoken PowerPoint around 10 minutes long, which explores how you can take on the connector role in reflective connections sessions. That spoken PowerPoint looks at the particular skills that are needed and looks at particular techniques that we've found helpful or other people have found helpful in taking on the reflective connections role.
So the University of Chester's Connections model developed very early on during the first lockdown. It seems a long time ago now, but we all suddenly went into lockdown in March 2020. And I think probably about a month later it would be, we were contacted by a principal social worker from one of the local authorities that we work in partnership with here at Chester University. And the principal social worker had obviously seen all his adult social work teams have to go very suddenly and quickly into remote working from their own homes, and contacted the university because he felt that people were struggling with isolation and feeling quite separated from each other, and all the new ways of working, as well as all the other anxieties that were around for everyone at that time. So he asked if there was anything we could do or suggest that might support the social workers during that time. So I think possibly with my practice educator head on, I immediately thought of what you need to be doing in this type of situation is somehow getting together, reflecting and sharing experiences. And so I replied to him, and colleagues replied with other things and offered some other very constructive things. But I said, how about we look at, could we run some reflective sessions for the social workers to bring them together? And he was very keen that we did that, and very happy for me to take it forward. And so I started to think about how we might do that, and had some sort of basic ideas, but had never done it before. In fact, it was very early days and we were still learning how to use online technology and what it would mean for us. It felt quite a responsibility, I think, to try and get it right and to try and not waste people's time. You know, the social workers were busier than ever. We wanted this to be valuable and useful to them. So we agreed that we'd run, I think we did 2 or 3 pilot sessions, didn't we? And the first one that we did, we were actually lucky enough to have a team manager that we both know. I think we both worked with previously, and that was just coincidental. But I think it helped because we exchanged several emails beforehand, and she was anxious. I recall her anxiety that we were suggesting people do a little bit of preparation beforehand in order to get the most out of it. And I know she was thinking, my team are really busy, I can't ask them to do anything else. But we said, you know, just try, just see how it goes. Let's, you know, we're all trying this together. And actually, it just, for me, that first session went so well, and was, you know, privileged to hear the social workers speak, clearly of benefit to the social workers. I think they even had their team administrator there. I think I might be right that that was one of the first teams that did that. So they used it very much to bring everyone together. They didn't separate out different roles within the team. Everyone was invited. And most people had done a little bit of preparation beforehand, and that worked out well. But I think we both felt quite exhilarated afterwards at how it had gone. And I remember getting emails from that team manager just saying how grateful she was for the session, how useful it had been for the staff to have taken part in it. I don't know if you recall those first few pilots and what you were thinking as they developed around us, Siobhan.
I do remember being, I suppose in a way, sharing that concern of that team manager about knowing how busy people were, and we were asking them to, you know, prepare, but not do too much preparation. We weren't asking for a lot, were we? But it was, you know, something we were asking people to prepare for. And not everybody did, but sometimes people, as long as you've got a few people that have prepared, others can kind of almost think it through in the session, can't they, and develop.
Yes.
So I think that's an important learning point, really, is that it does work much better if people are prepared, but you can also adapt and amend. So, but I do remember that first session and wondering whether, well, firstly, is anybody going to turn up? Are people going to do it? You know, are people going to be? But actually, people just valued it so much, didn't they? And the conversations about emotions, I remember feeling, I think, quite emotional actually at the end of it. And I've found that ever since, really, that often sitting with those emotions and some of the very strong emotions that people have experienced, I think has been, that's something that I think facilitators need to take into account, the emotional impact on them. So I remember some of those emotional feelings, but I also remember thinking about how when you experience something, it often brings your learning together, because one of the other things that I'd been doing at that point, because I had more space and time than I normally do, is I'd been reading quite a bit about moral injury, and I remember us talking about that really early. I mean, I'd only read an article, but it came to life really in those sessions, and listening to what people were sharing, I suppose in a way has really enhanced my own understanding of moral injury and what it feels like.
So we've talked a little about moral injury and how our understanding of this impacted as we were developing the model. But what is moral injury, and how is the reflective connections model influenced by it? Well, moral injury has been around for thousands of years. You know, as a concept, people talk about it in ancient Greek and Roman literature, but how we understand it today and how we see it as linking to occupation comes from the work of a psychiatrist called Jonathan Shea, working more than 20 years ago with Vietnam War veterans. So, used in the military, moral injury refers to the psychological distress that results either from taking an action or not being able to take an action which violates your moral or ethical code. And that's where the phrase moral injury comes from. It's something that injures your morals. Now, in social work, we tend not to talk about morals, we talk more about values and ethics. So in the work that I've been doing in moral injury, I've been thinking about, should I change it? Should I call it, a values-based injury or an ethical injury? And I know some people are using phrases like ethical distress, for example, which are similar. But I decided to keep to the concept of moral injury because there's a lot of work going on, particularly in healthcare, around moral injury. And I'd like us to recognise that this is something that people, professionals experience. It's not something that's unique to one area of work. So I became aware of moral injury very early in the COVID-19 pandemic, reading an article by Neil Greenberg and colleagues in the British Medical Journal. It was a speculative article really because it was written very early in the pandemic, but it highlighted the potential of significant moral injury for healthcare workers because of three things. Now this is Greenberg's wording, but because of these three things, because healthcare workers, they said, would need to think about how to allocate scant resources to what they described as equally needy patients, because they would need to balance their own physical and healthcare needs with those of their patients, and because they would need to make decisions about how to align their duty of care to patients with their duty towards their own family network. Now, when I read this at the start of the pandemic, I was thinking, well, social workers are facing those same sorts of dilemmas within the pandemic. Over time, as I've talked more about moral injury and I've thought about it with social workers, what I've realised is there doesn't need to be a global pandemic for social workers to be at risk of experiencing moral injury in their work. And that's where we then brought in our learning about moral injury into the development of the reflective connections model. As we've talked to social workers, then they've told us a lot about their experiences. And I'm going to share some of those experiences with you now. We have permission to share these, but they could be distressing to you. And as you listen to me telling you what social workers have been saying about their work during the pandemic, just be aware of the emotional response that you have to these phrases. So all of these are actual quotes taken from sessions that we've done since the first development of the reflective connections model. So there was a hospice social worker who had worked in hospices for more than 20 years, but when she said to me, here I am doing death and dying at my kitchen table, and it feels very different here, that made me realise that it isn't just what we do, but it's where we're doing it that can impact on us. There was a newly qualified social worker that I was talking to, and I knew members of her team, and I'm not very good with names, and I said to her, you know the guy I mean, he's the really tall guy. And she said, Siobhan, I don't know how tall anyone is. I've only ever seen my colleagues online. And that made me realise how potentially disconnected people have become from one another. People are saying things like, I'm doing what I can. It's never going to be enough. I just keep on asking myself, how am I ever going to get over all of this? Students saying things like, how are you supposed to learn about your profession when you're just sitting in your bedroom in the middle of a global pandemic? I feel like I'm just watching a television programme online or something. It's just not enough. Many people in the sessions that we've done have talked to us about thinking back on decisions with hindsight and maybe feeling differently about those decisions now, but one that really jumped out at me very recently was somebody talking about something they'd done 12 months ago, but they were still haunted by it. So this young social worker said to me, I'm haunted by what I did. This couple had been married to one another for 72 years and they never saw each other again after my intervention. And even every time I read that out, it gives me goosebumps to think about how must it feel to carry that as a social worker. That's not why we come into this profession. People talking about working from home saying, you know, I feel like my home's been invaded. When this is all over, I never want to come into this room again because of the things I've seen and heard and done in this room. And I feel guilty that I'm constantly telling family members to shush in their own home, or they can't come in the front room, or it's impacting not just on us, but on the people that we live with. It feels like a war zone. We've just got to keep on battling through it. People saying I feel abandoned by social work leadership. A hospital social worker who said, I was completely exhausted. I took Monday off work and I came in Tuesday morning and the automated system had allocated me 20 new cases for an urgent discharge. But by the end of that day, I closed 17 of those because the people had died. A team manager who said to me, it really hit me when I was just doing an admin task. There I am, sitting at a computer, closing case after case. And I had to keep on clicking the reason as death. And I realised that tears were just rolling down my face. It's loss after loss. How are we supposed to process all of this? And people saying to me, at the start of this, you know, I felt helpless. Now I just feel hopeless. I've completely lost hope. And if you look at some of the words on that slide, you know, people feeling haunted, abandoned, hopeless. This is stuff that's going to really impact on us as social workers. So we know that moral injury has a massive impact on people. You know, in many ways, it is similar to concepts that we are familiar with in social work, like compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma or even burnout. But what you wouldn't expect is you wouldn't expect people to experience those at an early stage of their career. And yet what I am seeing is students and newly qualified workers experiencing moral injury at really alarming rates. Neither would you expect compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, burnout to impact on whole staff teams. And yet I'm seeing that a lot, whole teams impacted by moral injury. We know that people who develop moral injuries are likely to experience negative thoughts about themselves or others, and feelings of shame, guilt or disgust are common in people experiencing moral injury. It impacts on practice and morale. I think it's likely to negatively impact particularly on core skills like analysis and decision making. The Awareness Therapy Centre, who've been doing quite a lot of work around moral injury in healthcare, they have medicalised, if you like. They refer to the symptoms. So we might say maybe the signs of moral injury. They can manifest themselves in changes in our sleeping patterns, significant or persistent changes in behaviour or habits, making mistakes, seeking to isolate yourself, compulsive behaviour, and a weakened sense of empathy or compassion. Lots of people tell me that they're feeling these things, they're seeing these things in themselves or their colleagues. This is very significant for social work at the moment. But what we know from research is there are things that we can do to mitigate how much moral injury impacts on us. And we sought to address as many of these as we could as we developed the University of Chester Reflective Connections model. So we know that where people feel that they're part of a team and they have a sense that they belong to a community of practice, that's really important. It can really help to mitigate moral injury. There needs to be a strong reflective culture that is embedded really at every layer within the organisation. People need good quality, emotionally supportive, reflective supervision. and the opportunity for an in-depth reflection with a particular focus on feelings and emotions. People benefit from education about the potential of moral injury and having permission to talk about it and explore the depth of the injury with colleagues. And it's also important that people feel that there is a clear recognition of the importance of the work that they do and value being placed on that work. So we seek to do all of these within the reflective connections model because we know how much this is important in terms of moral injury. And the final thing I'd like to say about moral injury is taken from a blog written by Esther Murray, who'd been doing a lot of work with NHS staff on moral injury, and it really chimes in with my thinking around moral injury. She says that the best support that we can offer right now is honest, open conversations so that people feel heard and validated in their experience, and that is what will help to get them through. Once we're through it, there will be different work to do. Whenever I've spoken about moral injury, she says, there have always been people in the audience who've breathed a huge sigh of relief because there's a name for the way that they're feeling. It's no different now. We really do need to find ways to talk about how we're feeling, both the good and the bad, so that we can bear it. It's silence that will do the harm, not talking. And for us, as we developed the reflective connections model, that was really important. Talking helps. So we know a little of the story behind the development of the model, and we know that it seeks to address issues around moral injury, but what exactly is the model and how do we do it? Essentially, it's a really simple model. I often find actually the most simple models are usually the most powerful, but this is really all about bringing a group of people together so that they can reflect together. We've only ever done it online. I'm sure it could be done in person, but actually because the model was developed for working online, it works perfectly in a virtual situation. So we bring together people online in an online environment. The group could be made up of a team, it could be a community of practice, so perhaps a team that are working with a particular family or a team that's working on a particular project, or it might be a group of peers. So for example, we've facilitated lots of reflective connection sessions for newly qualified social workers or for practice educators, so a group of peers. We know, of course, that there are major benefits to reflecting within a group, and the model builds on that but goes beyond the usual group reflection to build on the factors which mitigate moral injury. It's a simple model, easy to develop. The reflective connections model builds on the 3 stages of reflection. So we know that to have really effective reflective practice, what we need to do is reflect before, during and after. So the phrases that are often used: reflection for action, in action and on action. So we're going to talk you through a reflective connections session using those 3 stages: reflection for the session, in the session and on the session. In terms of the reflection for action, then what we really need to make sure is that group members are prepared for a session. I think we've already said that when we first started to develop the model, we were concerned about asking people to prepare and reflect for action because people were just so overwhelmed really with what was happening in the very early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. We felt that giving them something extra to do might be just too much. But actually, it doesn't take very long at all to prepare for a session, and it helps people to tune into the session. You will find that some people come and they haven't had time to prepare for the session, but generally then, as long as you start off with some people who have had the opportunity to prepare, the session usually can continue and people prepare or think through their reflection as they're listening to others. But what you do need to do is, before a session, provide a reflective task that people can prepare with. So when we first started, Bridget developed the really useful idea of asking people to reflect on something that was positive, a piece of work that had gone well or something they were proud of, and that has worked really well in reflective connection sessions. But you might also ask people perhaps to reflect on how things have changed for them and how they feel about it. With newly qualified workers, I quite often ask them to maybe reflect on their first 3 months or 6 months in practice. It doesn't really matter what the task is that you're giving people, but they need to have a task, something that they need to reflect on to bring to the session. And in addition to the task, you could suggest a model that might help them to reflect for the session. I've found that some of the models that work really well for preparation are head, heart, hands and feet, the 4 Fs, the University of York surprises, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, learning, or share, or getting people to develop a personalised weather report. There are lots of different models that you can use. You could, of course, use the usual models of, Gibbs model or Borton's model. I've found that generally component models work very effectively in a reflective connection session. So any model, give people something, a particular thing, piece of work or feeling or something, a task, something that they're going to reflect on, and then suggest a model that they might find useful to bring, or maybe a couple of models. In the early sessions that we developed, where we asked people to think about something that they were proud of or something that had gone well, we gave them 2 options. We suggested that they could use head, heart, hands, or they could use surprises to learning. It doesn't really matter the task that you give to people. You can be as creative as you like, but you need to give people something that they can reflect on to bring to the session. And then the actual session. Really, the actual session is 3 key stages, but they're sandwiched within introductions and conclusions. So you start off with a welcome and introductions. Clearly, if this is a group of people who don't know each other, they will need to introduce themselves to one another. If this is a group that know each other well, then you don't need so much the introductions, but you might need the welcome and just how are people feeling and a couple of minutes for people to settle into the session. And then you go into individual reflections. Each person in the group is invited to share their reflections for 5 minutes or so. If you've got a group of around 6 or 7 or 8 people, 5 minutes each is plenty. Very often, Bridget and I would start off with people saying, oh, I can't possibly talk for 5 minutes. And then you're getting where they're at the point of speaking for 8 or 9 minutes and you're having to step in to thank them and ask them to conclude their individual reflections. But this is key. Each person present shares their reflection. And in many ways, this is what's different from a usual group reflection. In my experience, often group reflective sessions, one person brings an issue to discuss and everybody else asks them questions. That's very different in a reflective connection session. Each person shares their reflection for 5 minutes or so without interruptions, without questions, without comment. It's just each person shares their reflection and then the next person and the next person until everybody has shared their individual reflection. And then the person in what we now call the connector role feeds back what they have heard within the session with a particular focus on what they have heard that connects the individual reflections. So there might be a particular theme that they see as connecting the reflections. There might be a particular issue that they have been thinking about as they've reflected in action whilst listening to the individual reflections. So the connector feeds back their reflections on listening to the session and listening to those individual reflections. And that feedback will be, again, for 5 or 10 minutes, the same amount of time that each person has reflected. The key difference here is that the connector hasn't been able to prepare for their individual reflection because they've just listened to everybody's reflections and then they give their feedback on those reflections. That's followed by a group conversation. So when the connector finishes their reflections, they might say, they're the connections that I heard, but did people hear a different reflection, a different connection, or how does it feel listening back to me reflecting on what you shared? So you're just going to invite a group conversation. Again, the group conversation may take 10 minutes or so. It's to give people the opportunity to talk about how it felt listening to one another and listening to the connector. And then the session concludes with thank you and goodbyes. The sandwich of the welcome and introductions and the thank you and goodbyes is very important. But when you remove those, this is just a simple model of 3 stages: individual reflections, a connector feeding back the connections between those individual reflections, and then a group conversation. But the third stage is also important following the session to encourage people to reflect on action. It's important that the person in the connector role writes up some notes. Those notes shouldn't be about the individual reflections. You know, they don't say this person reflected on this and this person reflected on that. The notes are purely what the connector heard as the connecting themes. So the notes might just be, you know, here were the themes that came out that connected the reflections. And then participants would be able to then add those connecting notes to their own preparatory notes that they will have made to bring to the session, and that provides an ideal thing for them to use for their own CPD, because they've got their reflection for action, so what they took into the session, and then they've got the notes that reflect on action, and they might then be able to add their own comments to those, and it's a really good way of them capturing the whole session for a CPD activity. So it's important that the connector follows up with a thanks for attending the session, and these were my thoughts, and thanks for the work that you're continuing to do. That third stage is very important within the sessions. So we're going to start to go through now a real life reflective connections session and give you some of those stages so that you can pull out those 3 stages within a real life session.
Thank you everyone for joining us today for this reflective connection session. I think you all know me, but I mean, you probably all know each other, but we'll just go around and briefly introduce ourselves in a minute, and then I'll explain the structure of the day before we actually start, or the structure of the session, I should say. So I'm Bridget Caffrey, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Chester, and I'm co-facilitating with Siobhan today. So Siobhan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Siobhan Maclean, and I'm an independent practitioner, and I'm a visiting professor at the University of Chester, and will be co-facilitating with Bridget. And
I'm Dave Fruin, independent off-site educator for Chester and several other universities in the Northwest.
Lovely, thank you. Good to see you, Dave. Diane.
Diane Burns. I'm an off-site practice educator. I've been working for Chester for a couple of years, and I work for another university in the Merseyside region.
Brilliant. Thanks, Diane. Good to see you. Vanessa, today we're going to consider how your role as practice educator has changed during COVID. And we invited you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on this, especially perhaps any positives or creative ways you've introduced to your way of working, using either the surprises to learning model or the head, hands and heart model before you came along today. Hopefully you've had time to do that. If you haven't, don't worry about it. You will pick up on it as other people talk anyway, so you will be okay, still be able to join in. And I'll invite each of you in a few minutes to speak in turn for up to 5 minutes. I'll time you and I'll prompt you if you need to start wrapping up. People sometimes think they won't speak for 5 minutes, but in our experience, once people start talking, they do normally speak for a good 5 minutes, don't they, Siobhan? People get going. So no one interrupts or comments whilst anyone else is speaking, or even between speakers, really. So we mute ourselves when other people are talking, if that's okay, please. So we're just listening to each other until it's our turn to talk. And then when everyone's had their turn, Siobhan will feed back to you some connections and reflections that she's made whilst you've all been talking, in order to prompt more of a group discussion. And then at the end, Siobhan will summarise and wrap the session up as well. So does that sound okay with everyone? Any questions at all? I wonder if there's someone who would like to volunteer to go first.
So from my own perspective, what I've actually enjoyed and been surprised about is the enjoyment of the adaptability and the flexibility necessary to obviously to develop in different ways. That's actually been quite illuminating, which obviously goes on to the next point in the surprises section, which was about obviously being compelled to think beyond obviously the way we normally work and the way we have done. Because I think a lot of the time, and I know I've been guilty of this, like on reflection, you do get very stuck in your ways of being a practice educator. And again, I think it's almost like it's given me a push to obviously think about alternatives and obviously how we go about doing things. Which obviously leads naturally into the satisfactions. So again, one of the big pluses I've found is like, because obviously we're working more and more from home, which obviously I mightn't be particular to everybody, but like obviously it has been to myself, is the ease of accessibility to documentation and the sharing of information usage via the internet. And there's so much like worth obviously from the internet and what it's actually got to offer, in terms of what you can use, like in the exercises, like in the documentation.
Who would like to speak next? Diane.
Use the head, heart and hands model. I suppose one of the things that I reflected on was that previously in my work role, I'd originally been a practice educator within that setting. So I was used to having students with me within the team. So that was very easy to listen in on telephone conversations, discussions with colleagues, and pick up that ongoing assessment. So I think I felt that as an offsite, I had a bit of a head start from other practice educators, because you had to rely on the relationship was different. You weren't seeing the student directly every day, so you had to be more drawing on other resources. So it made me think about that. I thought with the head part, I've got knowledge of the portfolio. I know what evidence I'm looking for. I know all the PCF domains, so I know what I'm doing. So that all remains the same. I just need to be sure that I'm gathering that evidence in the same way that I would be outside of the COVID circumstances. I had to think about communication, obviously verbal and non-verbal, and that was a bit more difficult with the non-verbal, actually seeing somebody online. So I think I was much sharper, much more focused, more active listening in terms of my supervisions. I had to be aware of myself in that and how I was listening and checking out that.
When the pandemic hit, I had a student that I was practice educator for, so I focused really on one specific area of learning for me. And I think I'm somebody, it's been a really useful exercise for me, because for those that do know me, you know, I can be quite pig-headed. I'm very much about social work is about feeling, smelling, seeing, touching, and this whole, you know, transition into remote working for me just didn't work. I really struggled with it. You know, how can we continue in social work when this is a new approach to working? So I was really down about it, and actually quite scared at the time of thinking, you know, I actually have no choice, I'm in it. And so I focused using the Surprises to Learning model uncomfortable on my first direct observation that I did. Again, you know, having quite negative thoughts about it beforehand, but having no choice because the direct observation had to be done and it couldn't be done in person. So I did a direct observation during a assessment of grandparents who had their grandson living with them. My student was doing the assessment, working with the family, but doing the assessment with the grandparents. The son was out, and I think my surprises were how well the grandparents were of an older generation, and I was thinking, you know, how they're going to manage all the technical issues. My student was amazing in supporting them to access all the technical element to coming online, which was a surprise to me, and I was surprised with how well the actual situation and the observation went, and actually how achievable direct observations are remotely. So I think for me, the satisfaction element of it was around, I think that both Diane and Dave have brought up, you know, you're far more efficient with your time, being able to, there's no travelling time. I think the biggest one for me, like Diane just brought up, is the lack of intrusiveness in direct observations. Having been a practice educator for many years, you know, there's so many observations where I felt so uncomfortable sitting in those really intimate personal situations where I felt that I'm not worthy of being there, and I shouldn't be hearing these, you know, really personal details that you're subjected to. So it was great for me being able to turn the camera off, pretend I wasn't there, they couldn't see me, it was all going really, really well. And then I kind of moved into the dissatisfaction element of it, which I didn't manage very well at the time, but reflected on it afterwards, was that the grandson came home. Now, clearly my student had an established relationship with the grandson, so hearing her voice was the norm for him. He came in, you know, hi to the student, and everything kind of carried on, but I became aware of the fact that he had no idea that I was in that room. So physically, when you're doing an observation, we can never plan for those situations, who's going to enter into a room, but you're physically there, so at least they are aware, and it would prompt a student or a family member to introduce you. But I found myself in a situation where I became uncomfortable, as I would do present in an observation, but for a reason. So that was my kind of dissatisfaction, which I reflected on after that, and with the student and it hadn't occurred to anybody else. The student, when we reflected on it afterwards, it hadn't occurred to her that that's how I might have been feeling. So I think there was some real learning for us both there in moving forward, in doing observations remotely. Yeah, that was me. So yeah, sorry it was so focused just on kind of an observation rather than sort of generally, but that's what I chose to reflect on.
And it worked really well, Vanessa. There's no apology needed there at all. Really interested. You having had the breadth from David, and you sort of dug down into the depth, and I thought you made some really interesting observations and reflections. Thank you ever so much. Who would like to go next?
I've used the surprises to learnings model, which, like Dave, I found a really helpful model too. So satisfactions, again, building positive relationships with students and on-site supervisors as well. So I worked with one student, one placement that I hadn't worked with previously. So building that positive relationship with the on-site supervisor as well was really rewarding and a satisfaction. Direct observations, I totally agree with what's been said so far in terms of feeling that I've been my presence has been less intrusive for service users. So instead of having another professional in the room, I'm hoping that that's really reduced those power imbalances for service users as well, by me being unobtrusive by a digital platform. Being the dinosaur that I am technologically, I resorted, because of my technical challenges, to using a whiteboard as part of my teaching, because unlike Dave, I haven't learned to share a screen yet and develop those online resources. but that helped me to have something familiar when I'm explaining some of the more abstract theoretical kind of concepts, or the interactive ones like Jodie Mardula's appetite path model, where, you know, I'm asking students about their experience and kind of filling it in organically as we're working through that teaching session. So that's helped me to ground myself really, as having some familiarity in my teaching. Some of the dissatisfactions, the main one for me has been technological problems. Vanessa will recall my first Teams meeting, I appeared horizontally and didn't have a clue how to rectify that. But issues with connectivity and students' anxiety around connectivity, especially in anticipation of direct observations. So we'd arrange to meet up 15 minutes before to check out the connectivity. People's cats, students' cats and dogs appearing, my dog's barking if somebody knocks on the door, in spite of a do not knock notice on my front door. There was one situation where, unfortunately, beyond the student's control, a family member joined our supervision session and started speaking on behalf of the student. So obviously that was a boundary issue that I had to deal with very, very promptly. In terms of boundaries of students working from home, again, children being present, so to avoid safeguarding issues of inappropriate discussions, the student would have ground rules, the students and myself, if they had a child in the house, we would have boundaries and ground rules that we'd talk about something safe. So something like we'd start to talk about the portfolio and the requirements within the portfolio, and then the student would send a written reflective piece about the service user that they were wanting to discuss, so that we could discuss that in the next supervision session. So it's working really flexibly and creatively according to the student's environment and obviously my home environment too.
Is anybody more surprised than me about me learning about technology? I had to learn it twofold really. One was through the work as an off-site practice educator, but also when I was working up until last Christmas as a children's guardian, and I had to do court hearings in my study at home. So it felt like the court was in your house, and these judges you don't always agree with were in your house. You know, you had to do assessments online, that kind of thing. But in some ways, that's actually helped me in terms of doing virtual work as a practice educator. It's kind of built my confidence a bit, sort of in a two-pronged way, really. One of the things I have found really useful, and surprising, yes, but maybe not, is the sharing of resources. I find that I can just turn my chair around and pick up a book off the shelf and physically show it to a student. Anyway, it has been a really positive new challenge once I got over the initial nervousness of doing virtual work. And as I say, doing court hearings and things, you know, kind of helped with that. I guess it was something that I needed to do at this stage in my career, was to have a relook at my practice and kind of reflect on things. In terms of satisfaction, I've obviously said, you know, sharing of information. I find that it's a lot less stressful getting to placements and travelling about and trying to, you know, you worrying that you're running late, what the traffic's going to be like, and all of that can stress you out no end. And it has me in the past, I'll admit. But, you know, I just find that I manage my diary better. I use my time better. Instead of perhaps going out for a full day doing placement visits, you know, I might just do a couple a day because it's much easier. And that means that I have more time to reflect on the sessions I've had, and also to write them up, you know, and have that kind of space to do it, really. I don't know whether colleagues would agree, but, you know, sometimes when you go into placements to see students, I've ended up in cupboards and all kinds of things, you know, trying to have a quiet space to work with the student, because, you know, obviously space is, you know, everything's been subject to cuts. So space is a premium, I think, in some places. So I found that, you know, not having to get there and then waste 20 minutes or whatever trying to find somewhere to speak is a real bonus, because it's in your study at home and the students obviously wherever they are. The other thing is probably more of a personal dissatisfaction, really. I just think that there's a need for universities and placements to be more aware of risk to practice educators as well. You know, people at the uni know that I have health issues and I've got mobility issues, so working from home has been really good for me. But I just think that I'm on the vulnerable list, so I have to be really careful. And I mean, last week was the first time in the 2 years I'd had a COVID test, and that was because I was going for a procedure on Saturday at the hospital, not because I had any symptoms. And I've worked so hard and given up so much to be well and not get ill, and I'm just a bit worried that you know, I'm going to be placing myself at risk when I don't actually trust the government's approach to how they've dealt with COVID and the fact that people are still dying. So I think just from that point of view, I'd just like to hear a bit more about how us as practice educators can manage that.
Emily, it's your turn.
And I've been thinking quite a lot about the transformative element of online supervision, because it's been so different. It allows students and me actually to reflect on how they learn and therefore make the process of learning more conscious, and certainly it's made me think about barriers to my own learning and understanding. And the other way that perhaps it's been transformative is just the pandemic itself. When we have radically different experiences, it turns our understanding of reality upside down. And it is at those moments where there's a kind of little chink in our comfort and our sense of reality, and we see things in new and perhaps enlightening ways. So curiosity is encouraged, and I found that has been a real advantage in supervisions, because we can think of real concrete examples of that, the world being turned upside down, and we can think of real examples of inequality and injustice. For example, the pandemic has shown us without a shadow of a doubt that there are structural inequalities, that racism exists, that ageism exists, and we can come up with examples of those, which has been really useful, because those things aren't stable, they're constructed, and they don't need to be like that. So I found that's given me a real opportunity to have that discussion and think of concrete examples which have jolted us all out of our procedural and kind of routine. And I hope that going forward that would help social workers now perhaps not be procedural in their practice and to be more creative, but also to have some kind of agency in that and think about yourself as an active practitioner and not a passive practitioner, because all of those inequalities are, and the things that we really should be angry about, are the bread and butter of our social work practice and will be the bread and butter of those, and that speaks to their values. So in that sense, coming out of something that's so horrific, I think that chink has allowed reflection from me and reflection for students too. Just even things like I've put up, like, you know, we're all in it together. Just that, well, we're clearly not all in it together. And it really resonates with them because it's a concrete example. I think the pandemic and working online is, in a way, we've had to realise that we can't control everything. And acceptance that we can't control everything is really quite useful and helps build resilience for social work. If I move on to, I think the only other thing for sort of satisfactions is having supervision away from the workplace. I found has really given not just a literal space, but a metaphorical space for students to open up more and speak a little bit more comfortably, because they're literally not in that space. The dissatisfactions, the things that I found most difficult is right at the beginning of the pandemic, because Vanessa knows very well, I had an international student and my relationship with her broke down. I'm still kind of unraveling that, but it really was something to do with her whole placement being online, with me not picking up on cultural differences and cultural barriers as well as I could, not addressing things like the deference she had for me as her practice educator, which is another cultural difference we wouldn't perhaps normally have. There's always power, but this was something quite different. So I haven't really got an answer to that, but something went wrong there, which I'm very clear that it went wrong, but I'm still reflecting on how that would work better in the future.
Thank you, Bridget. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I've been listening as everybody's been sharing their reflections, and I've written down some very rough notes. There's no order to this because obviously I've got no time to prepare it and put it into a neat order. So I'm just going to reflect back to you what I heard, and particularly with a focus on the connections. And then what I'd like you to do when you're listening to me is think about, have I got that right? Can you see where I saw those connections? Are the connections that you see that I don't see? And then we'll have a group conversation about the reflections coming together. So the first thing that I want to say is what came across to me was how student-centered you are. And I mean that in a very positive way, in that you were, thinking about learning needs and learning styles. You were responding to students' individual situations through the pandemic and how actually we're all experiencing this differently. So you were very student-centered, I felt, in what you were saying. Then I've written down, what I do is on my notebook, I write down just some key words and then that I'm hearing. And the first thing that I wrote down was the importance of prior experience. And I think that's because right from the start, when Dave started sharing with us, he talked about talking to students about their previous experiences and reflecting on those, and that being useful during the pandemic. And then after that, Diane first started off her reflection with talking about her own prior experiences. So it made me think about how important these prior experiences are. And then right at the end, Emily talked about moral injury, which I've been doing a lot of work with students and newly qualified workers. And I think it is a particular issue, as Emily's shared, for people who don't have the previous experience to draw on and build on. And so there was all of this, I think, throughout, from the start to the end and everything else. There was a lot of that was coming out of the reflections about the importance of prior experience, but also, we'll return to this later because it's not in any particular order, as I said, but also the fact that that prior experience can leave us a bit stale and stagnant. So it's interesting because we valued it, and yet we also saw that it can be difficult. The next thing that I've written down is space and place. And I think of all of the connections, this is probably the most significant connection that I heard. I think so many of you talking about spaces and places in lots of different ways, from Dave talking about using outside spaces and alternative spaces and private spaces. In your reflection, Dave, you used the word space more than 10 times, just right at the start of it. So space was obviously a big issue. And then Diane started us off talking about being in the office. What was interesting was there were some real positives, weren't there, about changed spaces. So I think if you'd have asked us as a group of practice educators 2 years ago, we'd have not seen those positives. But because we've been, in a way, as Vanessa put it, kind of forced into it, we've had to see those positives in spaces. I loved it when Linda was talking about, previously doing stuff in a cupboard after walking around an office for hours trying to find just a cupboard to work in, and I've been in that place. So I think that whole thing about there are lots of positives of spaces, but there are also some difficulties, like students working out of the bedrooms, like the the challenges in maintaining boundaries in these changed places that we're working in. And I just found it really interesting. And I was sort of thinking a lot as you were talking. My own reflection was about the difference between a space and a place, and you're providing these safe spaces for students, but not necessarily in the place that we used to do it. So we can still provide the space. And I think Emily used the phrase metaphorical spaces. And then one of the things I've written down, and it might be completely off the wall, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, because this is just my reflecting in action as you're talking. I've written down something about the future and futuristic stuff, because the word space to me a couple of years ago would have been about, going out into space. It would have been very futuristic. And maybe it's because it's been on the news recently, this private space race and all of that. And Dave said something that I thought was really interesting. He talked about being pushed beyond our traditional routines. And it made me think of, is it Buzz Lightyear who talks about to infinity and beyond? I don't know, there was something going on in my head about this space race, and we're kind of being pushed into something beyond where we've ever been before, almost beyond boundary, you know, beyond space kind of. I've not articulated that well, but it was just something I was thinking about. And then we come to the new stuff, which is the infinity and beyond, I suppose, but lots of things about new, everybody talking about things being new, Diane talking about how things can become stale or stagnant, and lots of people agreed with that. I think the way Linda put it was interesting. Linda said, it's easier if we're not challenged, actually, but I've been surprised how much I've learned from being challenged. And I think that new was really interesting. But I also liked the fact that Claire said, with all of this new stuff going on around us, it's good to have something familiar to ground ourselves. I liked the way that Claire put that, you know, and everybody was talking about new stuff, but also I think we all held on to something that was familiar to us in whatever way we did, but it helped maybe ground us. And I was struck by I suppose, the number of new words that were used, words that we would not have been using in a group of practice educators 2 years ago. Things like blended. I'm going to continue to blend my work. Would we have ever said that 2 years ago? And yet nearly everybody talked about blended, you know, so there's lots of new words that are very new. And it made me think about how language changes as well as practice changing. And then one thing that I found really insightful, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this, because I think it was about maybe the way I was listening to it, but I've written down less / more intrusive. And what struck me was there's a balance here, that some people were talking about things being less intrusive, particularly direct observations it came across that you felt were less intrusive. But then it was interesting because other people were talking about things being more intrusive, you know, so Dave talking about this huge cat appearing at the screen and, you know, it being in our own homes. I think Dave used a phrase of the psychological infringement of people's own homes, which was a really interesting phrase. So I think what struck me was, in some ways, our new ways of working are less intrusive, and in other ways, they're more intrusive. And then I had a bit of a light bulb moment, and I don't know if I got it right, but it seemed to me, and if it's true, this is marvellous, but it seemed to me that when you were talking about things being less intrusive, it was for people who use social work services in direct observations and so on. It was maybe less intrusive for families, our work as practice educators. Where things were more intrusive, it was for us, or students or professionals. So, you know, Linda talking about court being done in our own homes and things. So I think there has been more intrusion into the personal spaces, if you like, of professionals, maybe less intrusion into the personal spaces of people who use services. And I thought that was just an interesting point for my own reflection. And then the last couple of things, creativity, I thought you demonstrated hugely. I thought that was really, really significant. Hearing from others is important, I think, and one of the central themes of all of the reflections was about relationships in lots of different ways. And I think hearing from others and having those relationships important. And I really like the way Linda put it. I'd really like to hear about how other practice educators are addressing this, because, you know, like Emily said, we keep being told we're all in it together, and we're just not all in it together. So if we can talk about it, it helps us to recognise what connections there are, but also what differences there are. And then the final thing was, it struck me when Emily was talking, it wasn't necessarily just about what Emily said, although a lot of it was, so many words beginning with the letter C. So I listen out for repeated words or connected words, and one of the things that I do, and there were loads of words that began with the letter C. Emily used so many words that were all about concrete, constructs, chinks, culture, comfort zone, creativity, choices, control, critical reflection, crisis, change, being compelled, compensating for things, confidentiality, clarity, checking in, casual encounters, even to the cleaner. There were so many C words beginning with C. There was such a lot of alliteration. And then what I realized was those C words are what connected everything we did today. And we're at the University of Chester and we're doing a reflective connections. So all the words beginning with C, fascinating. But the final couple of things about just those listening out for particular words is I do listen for repeated words, and I'm going to be interested because we've never recorded one of these before, so I can listen out later and see if I got my numbers correct, can't I? But Dave, you used the word in your reflection, you used the word obviously 19 times. 19 times you said obviously, and I think that demonstrates how we're not valuing our reflections enough, because I think what you thought you were telling us was obvious to everybody, but actually it's different for everybody. And hearing your reflections was really positive. And I sometimes notice students using the word obviously a lot in their reflections, and I just thought that was really interesting, not to be negative about it, but just interesting that, you know, a repeated word. The final thing I do is I look at feelings. Any words beginning with feelings, I write those down on another space, another page. And I've not got many feelings today, which is unusual. There's normally a lot more, and I don't know why that is. I'd reflect on it differently. You talked a lot about students' feelings. Students' feelings, the overwhelming feelings you used for students were struggling, anxiety, and stress. So that's interesting, isn't it, that they were the main feelings you talked about when you talked about students. For yourselves, there were some really positive ones, like you talked about being glad, being happy, feeling satisfied, feeling confident, really good words. But there were the two most common words were worrying and scared. And that's interesting too, isn't it? Thinking about our own feelings through this and how we've worked with those. So they were my reflections, no particular order, as I say, but it'd be lovely to hear what your thoughts are, having listened to me sharing those reflections back. Are there any thoughts about what I've said? Anything that maybe you think, I don't know where you got that connection from. I didn't hear that. Different people on different days will hear different connections. And that's what's really important about this session, isn't it? Recognizing that. Vanessa, you put your mic on. Did you want to say something?
I really enjoyed listening to everybody else's reflections. And I think, you know, as practice educators, we can all relate to everything that everybody said, which was really interesting, you know. And I think as Linda was talking about the, you know, the space in a cupboard, you know, that made me laugh, because we've all been there. And I think when you looked at the less intrusive aspect, and you talked about how we picked up on it being less intrusive for service users, I also think for 70-day placements in PVI sector placements, I think it's less intrusive on organisations, because I think people can relate to almost feeling a little bit of a burden as an off-site practice educator visiting placements sometimes, because of the lack of physical space for supervisions. So I totally agree with what you'd said there, Siobhan, about I think service users have benefited, which is quite ironic, really, when you think about it in that way, because you really wouldn't think that remote practice would have such a positive impact on service users.
The surprises model was less emotional.
I wonder, Dave, if that's why I didn't get as many feelings words as I normally get. I wonder if, because when people use head, heart, hands, they'll talk about their heart. There's a lot more feelings, and you know, the number of feelings words that I wrote down wasn't as many as normal. So
that's what came across to me with it. That, and I suppose, like, obviously it was like I was looking at myself in terms of the reflective process, like I'm using that model, because I was looking at it from the emotional content of what I was actually saying and what other people were saying. And like you just said, Siobhan, I think obviously it was more directly associated to work as opposed to the emotional content of it. I might be wrong on that, but that's the way it came across.
It's a really interesting point.
what's been different here, it's been really thought-provoking being in a workshop like this, I think, and because we're all practice educators, and the fact that you're a practice educator, Siobhan, who is listening to our feedback and collating that, and you're very creative in the way that you're able to then relay that. But I think the fact that we're all on the same level, we are hopefully have a better ability to take on board criticism and constructive feedback if someone's coming our way. And I think that the difficulty with students sometimes, because it's interesting, isn't it? It's like we're listening to your observations of us, like students listen to our observations of them in observations. The difficulty then being, though, is when students disagree with what they're hearing and really struggle to take on board that constructive feedback. I think that's the difficulty, whereas the feedback for us has just been really thought-provoking. It's really interesting.
I think it perhaps helps to get it in a group, though, where you can discuss it, because, you know, if you had some negative feedback from a student and you were just on your own opening up your email at home, you know, the natural response may be to be defensive to that. I can imagine I would be. Whereas, you know, having a forum where you could go and safely discuss those things in this way might be helpful. I mean, I'm still kind of slightly stuck in having listened to you all, because I am a bit blown away almost by having listened to you all today and thinking that, you know, I probably haven't considered how much you've all adapted and had to work really hard to support the students. You know, I knew you were, but I really didn't get the depth of it, if I'm honest. I think that's what I would say. And, you know, the space thing really stuck out for me as well. You know, you were talking about spaces and the different use of space. And I think I've become much more conscious of space myself during COVID. And it was really nice to hear how many positive things there were about space. You know, for you, Linda, being able to just turn around and get your books. I mean, it sounds so small and simple, doesn't it? But it is actually, you know, brilliant that that has been facilitated and that you've been able to do that. You know, and that you've been able to advise students on how to put in boundaries around spaces, because I think we are going to be working in many ways like this for many years. I don't think social work is going to go back to how it was. When I hear what local authorities are saying, they're getting rid of offices all over the place. So, you know, to be able to give that advice to our students as well, and support them in working out what works for them and what space means. You know, hearing about going outdoors and doing reflections, I just thought that was brilliant, Dave. You know, take a student for a walk. You don't have to sit down and have supervision, do you? Why do we imagine you have to be sat down in 2 chairs to do supervision? You know, like today, this afternoon, if I was seeing a student, get outside in the sunshine. So I'm still stuck in that space of having listened to you all, but thank you for that. It was really fascinating to hear.
I think it's a good model in terms of clarity, you know, and looking at what you've been saying. First time I've done or used this model, so it's a really good learning experience for me, to be able to really think about what I'm saying. You know, we can talk till the cows come home, but actually, what is it that you're saying that's valid? And that's, I think, what it's done for me really is for me to understand that way of reflection and, you know, learning from it. It's not easy to share with others sometimes, is it? You know, but actually when you sit down and do it, it's not so bad after all when you use this kind of model. Yeah.
It is, and I think, like Bridget said, the 5 minutes goes really quickly, doesn't it? And I think having the connector role is the important one. I think, yes, having everybody, and what I liked about this, and thank you, Bridget, when you sent out the email that you did put at the end in brackets, you know, the preparation time, it only needs 10 minutes. And, you know, you're right, it actually does only need 10 minutes, but equally, you know, for the likes of Dave, who's very well planned and prepared as always, and allowing other people, you know, to speak first. It prompts, you know, things for you as well. For Emily going last, it allowed her to, you know, to knock some things off a list, and to, you know, it triggers other thoughts for others. So I like the way this works. People who feel comfortable and confident to go first. It's not forcing anyone into doing anything that they don't feel comfortable in doing. I'm kind of thinking you could do this in a placement week all day, because you don't have to be on a screen, do you? This would work if you split people up into smaller groups, and then you had the connectors all feeding back from different groups. That would be really interesting, wouldn't it, around students' reflections on their placement experiences.
Yes, absolutely. I think you could adapt it in lots of different ways, really.
When I was listening to people, I was making connections that, for me, that were similarities and things that it was that reassuring, I think, that other people were experiencing similar things or feeling similar ways. So I made my own connections, but then when you made those connections, you took that thinking that little bit further and in a different direction. So it is obviously that role is really important and must be different from being a group member. But
I agree with Diane. It's really interesting. I had the same shared experience, that I was listening to all the people talking about the challenges and some of the satisfactions, the dissatisfactions, and I was making connections with what resonated with me and my experience, and what I was hearing in the group were other people's experiences too. But as a connector, it's almost taking it to the next level, isn't it? Taking that meta level perspective and making different connections that aren't kind of personal and resonate with us as individuals. So it's a really interesting process.
As well, it's quite reassuring to hear those connections and empowering, you know, because, you know, one of the things I think a lot of people have said over however long COVID's been going is the sense of isolation that some people have felt, you know. And so sitting here and contributing and listening, I find it really reassuring, you know, that I'm not, the things I think and feel are not off the wall, or, you know, about me as a person, or, you know, me not being a good enough practice ed or whatever, you know, but to know that those feelings and those reflections are shared, and in that makes me feel stronger as a practitioner.
Some of the feedback that we've had about the reflective connections model is that people are worried about taking on the connector role. What I think is really important is not to be afraid of the role. This isn't particularly difficult. This is a role that draws on social work skills. You know, Bridget and I were social workers. We developed this using the skills that we've got, and we have social work skills. So taking the connector role is about emotional intelligence. It's about active listening, and it's about effective note taking. As a social worker, you've got all of those skills. There is no right or wrong in terms of the connections that you see and the feedback that you give. You know, other people might see different connections, and actually that's fine. Really, that's a good thing. We should encourage that. And it's a key part of the conversation, the group discussion that takes place after the connector has fed back, is about what the different connections are that other people have seen. Everyone, absolutely everyone, can do a good job of the connector role. And I've found it really interesting over time to see how different people make the role their own. You know, I've done this with groups of social work students where I've taken the connector role for the first couple of sessions, and then they've taken turns in taking the connector role. It's helped them to develop their skills, but they've been great at the role and they've made it their own. So don't be afraid of taking the connector role. Firstly, use your listening skills. So listen out for things like any words that are repeated often. To be honest, I sometimes don't hear repeated words, but I hear repeated sort of sounds at the start of words. So I might hear lots of words that start with in, or I might hear lots of words that start with RE. Reflection, research, resilience, that kind of thing. So just listen out for anything that you hear as a repeat. Listen out for any connections that you hear to the wider knowledge base. So for example, if you hear people talking a lot about legislation, that's a connection. If you hear something that you think, oh, that could connect to theory, then listen out for that. And just themes that start to emerge, and themes will emerge for you if you are just completely actively listening. If you are present in that moment and not thinking about other things, just present as the person is reflecting, you will hear themes emerging from the session. And the other thing that I would really encourage you to listen out for is listen out for positives, listen out for good stuff, because when, as the connector, you're feeding back to people, you really want to be able to give feedback that's positive and kind, and so listen out for anything where you know you'll be able to draw on that. Make sure that you tune into emotions. You know, one really important aspect of a reflective connections session is that it provides a space where people can talk about the emotional context of their work. People want to be able to discuss the emotions that they experience as a result of their practice, and this gives them the opportunity to do that. I would suggest that you keep a separate page where you make a note of any emotions words. So if anybody says an emotion, whatever that emotion is, whether it's positive, negative, whatever it is, write that down. I usually use a separate page. I think it's handy to keep them as a separate note because you can see which emotions are more often referred to. And when I'm feeding back from the connector role, I will usually, if the emotions have all been very, very different, then I wouldn't feed that back. But or I might do actually, if they were completely different, I might actually just feed back that they were very different. But sometimes I don't feed it back. But very often, especially if there's a lot of connections in the emotions, a lot of people talking about one particular emotion, I'll express that, I'll state that, I'll reflect that back to the group, that this is how it sounded to me listening to you. In terms of taking notes, loads of people have asked me about how I do this. What I found is all of the reflective connection sessions that I've done have been online. So for me, that's been really helpful because I can lay out my desk in a certain way and I generally have 3 pads that I work on, and I'll show you those, but I lay them out and I can write such detailed notes whilst people are talking. I find it easier almost when I'm not in the room with people to write loads of different notes. So I've settled on a particular technique that I think works quite well now. I start off by writing quite a lot of detail what the first person says, because at that point, you know, you've got no connections to make, you've just got what they're telling you. So I'll write down in as much detail as I can what they say. Then when the second person talks, I also write down what they say. I've generally got like an A4 pad where I'm writing those notes. But if I hear anything that connects that second person to what the first person said, I then turn to a reporter's notepad, which is one of those that you can flick over. And I'll write down the connection at the top of the page and then some notes underneath it. And then I've got another space, either a page or a little pad or something, where I write down any emotions words. So I tried to take a few notes, really. These are anonymous, these aren't from an actual session, but tried to just write a few notes and take some photos so that you can see how I do those notes. So as I say, I have an A4 page and I write in quite a lot of detail what the person tells me. I'll write down what technique of reflection they've used, because I might feed that back as a connection that everybody used the same technique perhaps. I'll write down something of what they say, and then that is because I've got no connections so far, I've got to write down as much detail as I can. Sometimes I write it in bullet points, but generally I just try and free write as much as I can and capture everything that the person's saying. Then for the second speaker, I'll do something similar, but I usually write a little bit less, because then I start to see the connections between, you know, there was a couple of connections here between what these two people said, and when the third person comes along, then you really start to draw out connections. And so I'll write at the top of the pad. I have a pad that's easy to flick over, and I'll write at the top of the pad the connection that I see. So you can see here I've written down skills at the top, and each speaker has talked about different skills, so I've written down what skills have been referred to. I would be likely then to feed back to this group at the end. something about your reflections demonstrated that you've got a lot of social work skills that you're drawing on. For example, Soyeb talked about communication skills and Jane talked about multi-agency working and so on, so that I can feed back, why did I see that as a connection? Why was skills a key connection? Because everybody talked about skills in some way. So it's actually, once you get moving, sometimes the connections aren't very complex. Sometimes they're the most simple things because you're just feeding back something incredibly simple, then that's okay. I do find that this kind of notepad is really helpful because it just flicks over really quickly, so I can flick backwards and forwards as the person's talking. And then, as I said, don't forget to keep a note of the emotions that people refer to. I just write down, anytime anybody says an emotion, I write it down, something about a feeling, I write it down just on a pad like this. And then when it's said again and again, I'll write it, I'll put a little line next to it. So here you can see that, look, exhausted's been mentioned 4 times, tired's been mentioned 3 times. So I would probably feed back to the group at the end. I heard so many of you talking about feeling exhausted and tired, so I get the feeling that that's something that's happening for everybody. And then I might ask them to think about how they might address that or how that might impact on their practice in the future, for example. So I do find just having that separate pad is just really easy because I know that there's going to be stuff about emotions that I want to feed back. So keeping that separate to the notepad where I'm flicking between the connections, I just find helpful. You might find your own way of keeping notes. This isn't, definitive. This isn't how you have to do it. I've just included something in this training video because so many people have asked me about how do I do it. The main thing is, don't be afraid of this role. Just give it a go. The thing is, there's no right or wrong, and people benefit so much from the feedback that the connector gives. Keep it kind. Keep it evidence-based, just base it on your listening, on what you've heard, and you can feed back how you felt listening in that moment. It's a real privilege to have the connector role. Just give it a go.